Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our webinar series today. My name is Dr. Suzanne Slack. I am a fruit specialist at Iowa State University. This is a joint adventure in fruit education from the University of Wisconsin, University of Minnesota, Iowa State University, and the University of Illinois. And today we'll be talking about how to purchase a high tunnel, and this is our beginner berry series. Today, we're happy to welcome Dr. Randall Voss from Iowa State University. Randall is a commercial fruit crop field specialist for Iowa State Extension and Outreach, where he provides technical assistance to fruit growers throughout the state. He has a wide range of experience in fruit production, especially small fruits. Prior to working in Extension, Randall was a production manager at a wholesale greenhouse, and he taught production-related horticulture courses at a community college. Welcome, Randall. Thanks for joining us. We're excited to hear what you have to say.
Thank you. Share my screen here. Okay. Everyone see the presentation? All right, we'll get rolling here. So thanks for the opportunity. So a lot of things to kind of think about if you're considering growing berries in a high tunnel, and a lot of it probably depends on what your goals are before you purchase this. So probably have a wide range of people on here, so we'll go over the high tunnel parts just so everyone's kind of on the same terminology. The general high tunnel types out there, some construction differences. Then some of the big differences are ventilation options, entry options, and then kind of go over how we would maybe do a price comparison type scenario. So if you're looking at your goals, some people's goals are extend the berry season. And if you want to extend it just a little bit, maybe get through a radiation freeze here or there, you can probably get by with a less extensive high tunnel. If you're trying to extend the season a lot, you probably need something a little more complex with end walls and so forth. So a lot of it's going to depend on what your goals are. For some people, it's increase in fruit quality and yield. There's been a lot of research in raspberries specifically about the increase in yield and quality from raspberries and other small fruits grown in high tunnels. For some people, it's trying to reduce predation from birds and insects and so forth. And others are looking at just trying to get less berry rot from precipitation. So kind of want to think through what your goals are before purchasing. A big one is temperature management, and it can both be issues when things get too hot or too cold. And things to think about if we're worried about the high tunnel getting too warm, you want to think about how you can get that high tunnel as open as possible. And some systems allow more opening of that high tunnel than others. And then the question I always tell people is we do have to think about being too warm in the winter too. We don't want these plants to deacclimate too early. And I know in Iowa, at least the last few weeks, other than today, have been very warm. And we have to be careful in the winter about it getting too warm as well, where we don't want those plants to deacclimate. Then conversely, in the winter, once those plants do deacclimate or we have a freeze event or a cold temperature event, we got to make sure we can seal it up enough that it doesn't get too cold inside. So we have to worry about both sides of that spectrum. Then when we look at what's our crop or what's our situation, am I growing a short-term crop like maybe day neutral strawberries, something like that, where I need to get in and out with equipment to build the beds maybe a little more aggressively or more often? Or is it a bramble, which is somewhat long-term crop where, yeah, you have to plant it 1 year, but we hope those plants last a decade or so. And so then you don't have to get in as much with a bed builder or something like that. Other things I kind of think about when going through this, or issues that I've had in high tunnels I've helped build, is what crop you are growing. Are you going to trellis these plants? You're going to trellis these plants, your sidewalls become a big big thing to think about because you can only get those trellises so close to the end walls. And so if you might be trellising raspberries or something like that, you definitely got to think about the clearance in that. And then other things to think about, if we're growing something like strawberries, you may need to rotate with another crop. And so what's that going to be? And what kind of access do you need to get in there? And let's say things don't go as planned and berries don't work out for you. You want to maybe think about what your backup plan might be for this high tunnel and how you might use it for a backup crop. So what I probably think we don't think about enough is equipment access. Or how are you going to do pest control? Are you going to get a sprayer into these? What kind of tillage are you going to need to do? Are you going to need to build beds and so forth? And so that's probably a discussion when we get towards end walls, but that's something that a lot of people kind of struggle to think through sometimes and might be something we need to put a little more emphasis on. And then do you have access to electricity or not? Some of these high tunnels, we have inflated plastic where you get access to electricity. And then how windy is your site? Do you have a windbreak? Do you not have a windbreak? Is it the top of a hill? Do you live in a windy part of the country like many of us do? Because some of these systems are a little more prone to wind damage than others. And then when are you going to use this? Are you going to use it 3 seasons, 4 seasons? And in the winter, are you going to leave the plastic up or take it down? And so those are some kind of situations or questions that we'll try and work through here as we go through this. So the main types out there, and everyone kind of differs in the terminology they use, but I'm kind of referring to them as freestanding permanent. So a Quonset would be like a half circle, and I'll show you some pictures here in a little bit. And then we have what we call a Gothic arch or a Gothic or peaked, depending on who you're talking to. And then we have multi-bay, where they're connected, and the greenhouse industry that I started working in when I got out of college, we called them gutter connected. There's no gutters with high tunnels generally, but you may hear me use that term. And then we have more temporary ones that are a little shorter in height, a little more narrow, that a lot of people refer to as caterpillar tunnels. So those are the kind of 4 main ones that are out there. So if you look at the structure of the high tunnel, just kind of again get on the same terminology. We have our sidewall, which is usually the longer part of that high tunnel. We usually have some type of ridge, and then we have our end walls. And most high tunnels are installed by pounding in ground posts, and the depth of those ground posts varies depending on how high the high tunnel is, but definitely got to make sure you have enough depth to be able to put those in. Then we have the rafters. Some people call them bows as well, and those vary in terms of how spaced apart they are. Some are 4, some are 6, some are 10 feet apart, and so a lot of companies are going to vary with that. So that's something you want to check on. You have purlins, and purlins run the whole length of that hoop or high tunnel. And again, there's different quantities of purlins depending on what your goals are and how you're using it. And usually we have some type of structure to form our sidewall and ventilation that a lot of people call a hip board. And then what will happen is the plastic from the hip board down is movable. So those are the main terms that we'll be using throughout this. So the 2 main freestanding ones, Quonsets on the left-hand side, again, it's basically a half arch. You can add sidewall posts if you need some more sidewall clearance. And then the Gothic or peach, there's several different kind of forms of that. Some are much more triangular and some are not, but these are some of the main ones. And my pictures have these hard corners on them, but usually they are more of a rounded edge to these. So if we look at some of the main differences, on the left-hand side, we have our Gothic, and on the right-hand side, we have our Quonset. One thing to consider is on the Gothic type, most of the sidewall is on a completely vertical wall. You're always going to get some wind blowing in water during a rain event, but one of the issues some people don't like with the Quonset style is that roll-up side is on an arch, and the higher you get it, the more that is hanging over the inside of the high tunnel. And so as you roll that up, if you have a rain event, your high tunnel's open, you can get quite a bit of moisture on the side there, not just from wind blowing in rain, but also from the rain coming off that high tunnel into that area. So some people don't like that, so they prefer the Gothic arch or Gothic style in that type of situation. Both of them are, again, are going to have wind blowing in, but one of the pros of the Gothic is the rain will coming off the plastic isn't going to generally drop right into that internal area there. The other thing I mentioned is we talked about trellis height and so forth. So if we compare, you know, a Quonset to a Gothic arch, and here I got some raspberries that are trellis there. If you're trying to fit a certain number of rows in, which you probably need to make sure you can get enough plants in to turn a profit, you are a little bit more limited in how close you can put those to the sidewall in the Quonset style, because, you know, you might have a 6-foot trellis or something like that. And you might have a little more clearance with the Gothic style, and you might have to move your rows a little more narrow in the Quonset compared to the Gothic style. The other thing, if I'm laying beds with the tractor, or I need to get a tractor in these for tillage and that kind of thing, you have a little more clearance with the Gothic in general, just because it has those straight sidewalls, versus the Quonset style. It gets a little more challenging to build beds or till or do that kind of thing if you have limited clearance on those sidewalls. So again, if you're going to be in there quite a bit with tillage, you need to think about adjusting your sidewall height, or choose the style of high tunnel that's appropriate for your situation. So looking at some positives and negatives, Quonsets are usually pretty cost effective, pretty simple to build. And oftentimes they have end walls with them. And so you can close it up to manage those cold nights a little bit. The negatives, you can only get them so wide. So 30 foot's pretty standard. There are a few that can get wider, but they do get more expensive as you get them wider. Sidewall clearance can be an issue. Like we mentioned, the roll-up height is limited, because as that sidewall gets higher and higher, more chance for water to drip in. And the main concern a lot of people have with the Quonset style is since it has a flatter top in areas of high snow load, that snow can sometimes just set on the top, and it can weigh things down. And just from when I worked with these in the greenhouse industry, we had some Gothic style, and we had some of the Quonset styles. It seemed like there's a little more flex in the Quonsets in the places I've been at. I think it's because the tubes fit interchangeably pretty good, and so they flex a little bit more. But the negative of the Quonset is basically anything from the hip board up, that plastic is on there for the life of it. Hopefully the wind doesn't blow it off, but you can't move all the plastic. You can only move the plastic from the hip board down. And so you don't have as good a ventilation as some other systems. The Gothic, there's a lot of similarities between the pros and cons. From my personal perspective, they flex a little bit less in a windstorm. Again, that could just be the ones I've been worked in. The snow generally is a little bit less because there's a peak. The vertical nature of that sidewall is really nice, and so you get a little more clearance. They sometimes are a little bit pricier in terms of the Quonset, and you still have a limited width, so that has the same negative there. And the same negative is the plastic from the hip board up isn't very movable. So when it's really hot in the summer, you have limited options. And some people have experiences that because they tend to have a little bit higher profile, because they're peak, that they catch the wind a little bit more compared to the Quonset. And I've heard various statements for or against that, but that is a concern that some people have. So the multi-bay or gutter connected, these tend to be a little bit lighter built structures. The nice thing about them is that you can connect a bunch of them together. And so you can have a lot larger area. There's some negatives associated with that. One is water, but the nice thing about them is you can push that plastic up very high, and you can get really good ventilation with them. Probably more so than the freestanding Gothic and Quonset style. The negative by connecting all these together is that water just gets concentrated, And so a lot of people end up putting in tile, between each of the trusses or rafters, and to get that water out, because that water just gets so concentrated in these areas, you get some erosion or some mud situation. So the other nice thing about them is you can easily take the plastic down in the winter or in a storm. And so, yeah, the question with that is then we don't have to worry about it getting too warm in the winter. But the other hand, now you're at risk for cold temperature. But some people like the ability to easily take this plastic off and on because it's not secured as tightly as with the Gothic and the Quonset style freestanding ones. So positives, they're probably cheaper per acre because they're not freestanding. Fairly easy to build. You can get a lot of width on them because you're just putting them next to each other. One of the negatives is they tend to have open end walls or less complex end walls, and so it's a little harder to close this style up. And but one of the positives, like I already mentioned, is the plastic can be removed. Another thing about them that people don't tend to like is they tend to come with less purlins, and so they're a little more prone to wind damage. And like I mentioned, they generally don't have as much for end walls, and so it's nice because you can get equipment in and out without having to go through a narrow door or something like that. But the negative is you can't really, other than a light radiation freeze or something like that, they're much harder to close up. Caterpillar tunnels, and I have some photos from my colleague Dan Filius, who does vegetable extension. He helped me out with some photos. These are becoming more popular. They're pretty easy to build. A lot of them are kind of self-made. They're pretty inexpensive because we're not trying to have a 4-season structure. It might just cover 1 row or 2 rows or something like that. And so the pros and cons are about the same thing. They're inexpensive, they're easy to build, and they're temporary. So some people have talked about doing things like day neutral strawberries in here because we don't want to get too hot in the summer. Then maybe you can throw one of these over in the fall to extend the season somehow. And because they're narrow, you don't tend to get that heat built up as much. But they are a little more prone to wind damage. You have to kind of redo them quite often. You can't put as much in them because they are narrow, and you're probably not going to get much equipment in there. But most people don't find that to be an issue because you build the beds, you plant, then you put these up afterwards. So it might work good for some more temporary small fruit crops like strawberry, day neutral strawberry or something like that. So there's a lot of construction differences. I'm not going to read through this whole list here, but before you purchase, these are the things you want to look into. And I'm not saying there's a right or wrong on any of these. It's a matter of what do you need for your situation. If wind is an issue for you, you want to make sure it's very strongly built. If wind is not an issue, you probably don't need it as strongly built. And so, again, I'm not going to say that there's a certain rafter spacing or whatever that you have to buy. It all depends on what your situation is. So the first thing I would ask you to think about is the sidewall height. So here's a high tunnel I helped build. And we did high tunnel brambles in here is what we did when we first built it. So we opted for the extended sidewalls. And so the kit came with shorter sidewalls. I think we increased it by 2 feet, if I remember correctly. So we wanted more clearance because we were trying to grow some high tunnel brambles. And so we wanted to be able to get our trellis close to the end or the side. That has some pros and cons. You get more clearance, but you have much taller ground posts and they have to go much deeper into the ground to deal with that increased height. And so that's something you got to think about. Do you have the soil depth to accommodate that? And because it's now much taller, this wind bracing becomes all the more important. And we probably under braced this one. We had a storm go through and it got a little out of kilter. And so we probably underbuilt this particular one. because it did have some wind damage. So if you're going to extend the sidewall height, you want to make sure you have really good wind bracing and room for those extended ground posts to go deeper into the ground, because the taller it is, the deeper those ground posts have to be, just from a leverage perspective. The rafters come in various forms. Most of them are just a circular tube, and that's pretty standard. There are some companies out there that are doing more of a oval or rounded rectangle, and those flex a lot less because that tube isn't symmetrical. When the pieces interlock, they don't shift as much. And so again, pretty standard to have the circular ones, but some of the heavier built ones have more of a oval or a rectangle. They tend to flex a little bit less. And so that's a positive about them, but again, it's probably more expensive because you're paying for more metal. So what I did is I looked at I think 3 or 4 of the common manufacturers that I had taken pictures of, and I just looked at some of their different models and looked at the rafter spacing and then the tube diameter and gauge of metal. And there's a pretty wide range. Some were 1 2/3 inch outside diameter, and some were 2 3/8 inch outside diameter. And so generally, the wider they are, the diameter, the stronger they're going to be. And then the steel itself, how thick was it? Some were 14 gauge and some were 16 gauge. And so the 16 gauge is going to be a little thinner metal than the 14 gauge. And so when you're pricing these out, you want to make sure you're checking that you're comparing things fairly to compare the prices. And then one of these businesses had the oval or rounded tube style. So and probably the 1 2/3 inch one on the top is going to be a little lighter built than the one right underneath it. That's 1 3/8 inch and 14 gauge. So if you need that heavier duty, you want to probably lean towards that. And then rafter spacing, that's going to add to strength. 4 feet between rafters is going to be stronger than 6, and 6 is going to be stronger than 10 feet apart. And so you want to check your quote and to see what are they planning on. And a lot of them, you just can tell them you want the rafters on a tighter spacing, but before you just compare packages, you want to make sure that they are the same rafter spacing so that you're comparing them in a fair way. And so that's something that I think gets overlooked from time to time. Purlin numbers varies a lot, and it's not always accurate to say that the more purlins, the stronger it is, because it could be other things differ in terms of how these are built. But a lot of the multi-bay ones, 1 purlin on top is fairly typical. And a lot of the freestanding ones vary from anywhere from 3 to 5 purlins. And so if you're in a high wind area, you probably want more than 1 purlin, and because they prevent that hoop from shifting back and forth from end wall to end wall. And so that's something you want to compare. And you can always add more if you want to, but there is an additional cost when you add on these purlins. Trusses is another thing. In some packages, they come standard, and others it's add-on. So that's another thing that you want to look into. So we have our rafters here, and the trusses are the horizontal, and they usually have an angle there. Some people will even go so far as to hang trellises from the trusses, and you definitely wouldn't want to do that if you didn't have trusses on there. And even then, that's a lot of weight on those. And so I would check when you're buying it, if you're in a high wind area and so forth, you probably want to consider getting one that has trusses, or ask if it's an add-on or does it come with a package, because I've seen both ways. One I bought in the past came with it, the other one it was an add-on. And so those are things you want to ask yourself. And then there's all different ways of how the metal's attached, and I'm probably not covering all of this. The wind bracing is fairly standard. You're roughly attaching it to form a triangle here to prevent that from leaning over. But the way the purlins are often attached is very different. Some come in these wraparound connectors, and some people like them because you're not screwing into or drilling a hole into the rafter, and some people think that weakens it, and it gives you some flexibility where to put these. So these wraparound connectors are pretty convenient to use. Some of the packages come with a strap like this, and so some people like that because it's literally just a self-tapping screws directly into the rafter. And so it's secure that way. And other people will opt to put a bolt through there. And some packages come with all the holes pre-drilled. Others you have to do it yourself. And I've heard complaints from some people that sometimes those pre-drilled holes aren't very accurate, so that gave them some frustration. But again, lots of ways to look at it. I have heard some people say that they weren't as comfortable with these strap type connectors, and so even if it came with them, they opted for drilling a hole through them. But again, that probably depends on your situation. End walls. The thing with end walls is, again, some packages come with them, some you have to buy them separately. And so when you're getting your quote, that's a big question to ask because they are a fairly high cost item. And I've built them both ways. I've built them out of just some tube steel, like you see on the one on the right-hand side. And I built them out of wood. I didn't build the one on the left, but in my personal experience, the ones that I've been a part of, the wood's definitely going to be stronger, but it's going to have to be replaced at some point because wood rots. But there's a lot of pressure on those end walls from time to time, and so that's something to think about. Is will whatever you're using provide enough support for some heavy winds? And all the ones that I put on always had a polycarbonate. That's the rigid plastic end wall. You can use the plastic film, the polyethylene, the flexible stuff. But because it's a flat end wall, it does take a bit of a beating. And for me personally, I've always found it to be advantageous to use rigid polycarbonate for the end walls. It is expensive, but to me, it was a time savings, but again, it is going to increase the cost. So that's something you want to ask as well. And then how does the plastic attach? There's various types of channel out there. Most of them are held together with wiggle wire channels. So there's a groove in here that you put the plastic in and the wiggle wire goes in there. I have always preferred to opt for the type of channel that has a little bit of a lip on it. So here is where the plastic is going to go in, and then this lip covers the polycarbonate panel. And I find that to be very handy because if not, water and stuff will get into that polycarbonate, or you have to wrap the plastic over and have a wiggle wire channel on the end wall. And I'll show you some pictures of that here in a little bit. So some packages come with a standard aluminum lip over the polycarbonate end wall. Others, it's just the wiggle wire channel itself. Then you have to think about how you're going to get that to seal a little tighter. So I've always opted for the ones that have the lip that holds that polycarbonate in there and prevents water from getting in there. Because once water gets in that polycarbonate, you can get mold growing in there and less sunlight and so forth. So here's an example of one that didn't have that. It just had the wiggle wire channel on it. And so to get this to be able to seal and not get water coming in this polycarbonate end wall, they had to pull the wiggle wire or pull the poly over and have the wiggle wire channel there. So again, that's just a personal preference, but something to think about. And then things to think about from your hip board down. Some people like to have a wiggle wire channel on the area from the hip board down to the bottom. Other people opt not to. If you're trying to keep it, let's say it's cold temperatures in the spring and the windy weather, I would consider buying the wiggle wire channel for this narrow section here. So if you have wind issues, you can always put a wiggle wire here to seal it for those few nights where you have very cold wind. Some people try and do it with rope, and that can work too, but it's probably a little more prone to wind damage. Then how are you going to attach your hip board? So those hip boards, you basically have a couple options: either attach it directly to the rafter, or you wrap it around. And so here is the wiggle wire channel, that's the hip board. And here we have a strap that's bolted through, and then the strap is bolted to the rafter itself. This, you can buy wider straps than this, but I have seen, like in this situation, where that strap wore out a little bit, and so that caused that to flex a little bit more. A lot of people end up opting for putting a wood hip board, attaching that wood directly to the rafters, and then attaching the wiggle wire channel to that board. And they believe that makes it a lot more sturdy because of that, and I would probably agree with that. And if you're in a high wind situation, that's something to consider with your hip board there. Then you do, how many plastic layers do you put on? The Caterpillar tunnels and the multi-bay tunnels is generally one layer of plastic. For the freestanding ones like the Gothic Arch and Quonset, I have always put on 2 layers of plastic, and you have an inflation fan to make it into a bubble. Seems like the plastic lasts a lot longer because it's not whipping around in the wind, but you have to have access to electricity then. And it does provide a little bit of insulation then. There's negatives with that, and one negative is it gets disgusting between these plastic layers. You get a lot of flies, and certain times of the year, depending on the humidity inside and outside of the tunnel, you can get a lot of water in there. And so you may need to poke a weep hole in there every now and then to drain that water out from time to time. But you're going to get a little more temperature buffering with the 2 layers of plastic. Your plastic is probably going to last a little bit longer, but you need to buy 2 layers. And so those are some factors to kind of think through. So then we get into ventilation on the sidewalls, and basically there's 3 main options. I'm just going to move ahead to that. The drop down type is probably the most common, and basically the plastic is attached at the hip board, and you roll it or unroll it from the top down. And it's probably the most simple construction, but some people don't like it because the wind is blowing in right at the soil height. And for newly transplanted plants, that can be a little tricky. Couple things also to think about is how you roll these up and down. There's various cranks, or there's automatic ones that I'll show you that have their pros and cons. I would definitely put in plastic, a couple rafter sections, because this will help prevent wind from getting in there. So some people choose to do this, some don't. If you're trying to prevent wind from getting in on a cold day, this is just going to help it. So as that plastic goes down, there's a little bit more of a barrier rather than having this completely open. So to me, that's something that I would consider adding depending on your goals. The negative of these drop downs is they can only get so long. Some people say 150 feet or so. Regardless, the longer they are, the more they bow. The plastic, as you're rolling it up and down, it wraps much tighter in the middle than on the end walls. And so as you're rolling it up, you're going to be tight on the top here, but you're going to have this bowing down like that. And that's why you can only have them so long. And it's not necessarily the worst thing in the world, but it bothers some people. And the longer you get it, the more that becomes more of a boat like that. So you can mechanize the drop down type curtains or drop down type sidewall ventilation. The key is you have to buy a controller and then the motors to run it, and you still have to manually watch them, especially turn them off when there's risk of snow. If there's any risk of snow, if you look at this picture, it's 44 degrees. When I took this picture inside the tunnel, it was 18 the day that I was walking around. And so it may have told that to vent when it can't roll up because of the snow. And so you can burn those motors out pretty quickly if you constantly run them on automatic. So the drop down type, generally the sidewall is made out of more of a fabric than plastic. And there's a series of pulleys that raise and lower this. So a lot of people like it because as the wind blows in, it has a chance to mix. And so you don't get that cold temperature shock as much. Sometimes these are an add-on in terms of cost, and sometimes you can switch between the drop down and the roll up, and it's the same price. But for really long high tunnels, usually the drop down, it's like a 200-foot high tunnel. If it's not the multi-bay type, the drop down is probably the only option you have, just because those roll up sides can only be so long. And then the anti-billow, there's different ways to do that. So basically where that movable part of the plastic is, that's very prone to flapping around in the wind. Some people like these eye bolts. I prefer these little clips. You can clip them into the wiggle wire channel or attach them to your baseboard. I have hit these eye bolts with the mower. I have tightened the curtain so tight that I bend them, tighten the line so tight that I bend them. Either ones work. You just have to be a little more careful with the eye bolts than with the clips from my personal experience. For the multi-bay and the Caterpillar tunnels, it's mostly a manual push-up. And the nice thing about them is you can go very, very high on those. So it's nice because you have the flexibility to open and lower it as much as you can, but it's all done by hand. And so it does take a bit of maintenance from that perspective, but there's definitely some pros to this. The fact that I can raise this plastic as high as I want it, depending on what I need to do. Then we get into end walls. You want some type of ventilation in your end walls. I'm not going to get too detailed into this, but on a very still day, where you don't have airflow horizontally through this tunnel, you want some type of end wall, whether it's louvers like on the left-hand side or just a regular vent, so that hot air can passively move out of there. And so I would encourage you to put something in that peak, especially if it's the Gothic style where you have a peak, just so you can get some passive air movement out. They do sell ones with a ridge vent. So there's a rack and pinion type setup here where it's like a little gear that moves us up and down. These are nice, but when I did a rough price of something like this, it can increase the cost by as much as a third to the cost. And it can also become a management struggle. The wind can catch these if it's coming from the wrong way. If you don't have a wind sensor, this can blow off pretty quickly. A lot of greenhouses now have wind sensors that once the wind hits a certain speed, it shuts these down. And that's the challenge in the high tunnel if you don't have something like that. So super nice for venting in the summer, but they're quite expensive and they do require quite a bit more work. And then entry options. Do you need equipment? You know, open end walls are nice for moving in equipment, but wind gets in there, can push that plastic up, and you can't close it up and you're as good. Wide entrances are pretty nice as well. You can get some equipment in there, but you can close it up for cold temperature management, but some of these have wind issues too. Then a narrow entrance, it's pretty tough to get equipment in. It's nice because you can shut them down. And so here's the open end walls. That's pretty self-explanatory. Again, you can't close it up for a cold, windy day. Then we have some wide entrance options. This particular one has hinged doors, and I personally wouldn't like this one just because where I live, it's super windy. And so if I have a very long door like that and it's hinged, I would worry about on a very windy day struggling to shut this. Some people like these roll up fabric ones. I do like this style. It's got a pipe in the middle and the gearbox is here. So you're cranking the gearbox here, and as you roll it up, it's kind of moving twice as quickly than if you have the gearbox on the bottom. And this pipe in there is also providing some protection from the wind blowing it in. So here's one where the roll up is on the bottom, and these are quite a bit more prone to some wind issues. You can see here the tarp or fabric is pushing in quite a bit from the wind because it's just this huge sail. And what also tends to happen is they tend to bow in the middle if they're not supported adequately. And so I have seen some people put in a temporary 4x4 or something like that when they don't need to get in there with equipment to keep that from bowing down from the weight, and also from keep the wind from pushing in. So that's something you could do to kind of mitigate that. Some people like these rolling doors, and they're nice for human entrance and for small equipment. The problem is they can only cover about half of the entrance. And so this other half over here is got poly on it, polycarbonate. And so you can't get equipment in to the extent that you can with some other options. And so while they're nice to use, they do limit your equipment. And here's a narrow entrance, just a human passage. Again, it's maybe fine to have one of these on there, but it's really challenging to get equipment moving through there. So some things to think about with entrances that I kind of just want to reiterate. If I have a narrow entrance, basically all my equipment can only get in from one side. And so you're always backing in whenever you're doing this kind of thing. And so if you have to build beds or get a sprayer in there or what have you, you're always backing in and working your way out. So if that's a concern for you, you're going to want wide entrances on both sides. The last one I built, this is what we had. We're only building beds once a year, and so we're okay with backing in, but it can be a problem for some people. The other issue is that even if I have a wide entrance, is if that wide entrance is not over the entire end wall, it really limits how you can get in there. And so here we have a fairly wide entrance, but I can only build a bed with my tractor clearance. And so if you're doing strawberries or rotating vegetables or something where you have to build beds a lot, you have to either stay a certain width away from the end wall, or you got to build all these beds along that sidewall by hand. And again, maybe that's not a big deal, but it is more work to think about. The other option is you get as close to that sidewall as possible, and you crank the steering over, but then you still have this area down in the bottom right that you have to build by hand or is unused. And so I would think a lot about your end wall situation in regards to how often you're getting equipment in there, what kind of equipment you're getting in, and what are you okay with doing by hand. And then the other thing, we're always trying to use space efficiently. And I've run into this where, a grower was trying to maximize the use of their space, and there's a little bit of a hill on the other side of the high tunnel. That can be an issue too. It wasn't hilly in the tunnel, but as you're building beds, if you're running that tractor and then there's a hill immediately after that, it's really hard to build nice even beds because that tractor is at an angle and the bed builder's just digging into there. And so that's something to think about. Maybe you don't have your high tunnel as long as what you want, but it's easier to build your beds if that's your goal. So kind of some things to start to wrap it up. Always think about other costs to get water there, cost to build it. Do you have to do some grading? Do you need electricity? It costs the same to get water to a small high tunnel as to a big high tunnel. So that's a pretty standard cost. And then you're going to have to replace the plastic and sometimes end walls as needed. And so that's a continuing cost that you got to factor in. So when we're pricing these things out, I would encourage you to price them by the square foot. So it's pretty simple. You get your price. So in my example, it's 10,000, and the high tunnel is a 30 by 96. So that's about 2,880 square feet. And so that's about $3.50 a square foot. And so that's how I would price compare. A lot of cases, if you go to a more narrow tunnel, so say 20 foot, the cost doesn't decrease that much. And so while they're cheaper per tunnel, they're not cheaper per square foot. And so you want to price it out that way. Now, when I ran a few scenarios, usually the 30-foot ones were the most economical for the freestanding ones. Once you got a little narrower, a little wider, price per square foot got a little more expensive. And I want to reiterate, that the 20 by 72, and I just made up some numbers there, might be cheaper, but I have the same water costs as running it to a 30 by 144. And so if you're trying to make money at this, you got to spread that water cost over, that to get that water line in there over the whole tunnel. And so sometimes building a lot of smaller ones is more expensive because your costs aren't spread out as much. The other thing I would say, length. The longer the tunnel, generally, the more cost effective it is. And that's because your end walls are pretty pricey. And if I have a lot of very short tunnels, short in length, I have a lot of end walls. And so you have an added cost there. So generally, as the tunnel gets longer and longer, your cost per square foot goes down a little bit because your end wall cost is spread out over more area. So the last things to kind of think about, questions to ask when you're looking at these packages. If you're looking at a pre-made package, again, what's the rafter spacing? What's the diameter of the tube? What's the gauge? I would always want to know what the hip boards are and what are they made of. Are end walls part of the package, or is that an added cost? And same thing with the entrances. Is that an extra cost I have to add on? How many purlins are there? And then are trusses included, or is that an add-on? Because that can add to the cost quite a bit. And then depending on your crop, do I need to extend those sidewalls, or does that push me into only using a certain type of crop? So that's kind of wraps up what I had to cover. So I'd like to thank Dan Filius for letting me borrow his photos quite a bit, and then we'll open it up to survey and questions.
Thank you, Randall. I think if you want to stop sharing, Josie's going to share the survey questions. Yeah, While everyone's doing the poll, we can start the question answering. So someone posted in the chat a question for Randall. So on the location of the high tunnel, should it be oriented to the south for maximum sun or oriented towards the prevailing high wind to avoid damage, or both?
Yeah. It probably depends on what your goal is. Since we're not trying to, if you're trying to grow like winter greens and trying to maximize as much sunlight as possible, and you have a single bay high tunnel, I'd probably orientate it east-west to try and get all that winter sun as possible. But I would lean towards north-south orientation, but again, it's not like it's a deal breaker, just because if you're going to have rows of stuff, like trellis raspberries or something like that, you're probably going to get a little bit better light distribution with those rows running north-south. But it's not a deal breaker. In the vineyard world, we talk about running rows north-south, but ultimately it's if I have a very narrow plot of land, I'm going to run those rows the longest long way, not the short way, because it's cheaper. So I think in ideal world, if you have trellis stuff, would be north-south, but I don't think it's probably a huge deal. But I always tell people your practices probably make a bigger difference than some of these items, but that's me personal opinion. So
Thanks. So another question in the chat from Keith, plastic covering considerations. So thickness, light transmission, UV stabilized, and the effect on the crops.
Yeah, so in the greenhouse world, 6 mil plastic is pretty standard. I think some people use 4 mil, but you just don't want to go to your local hardware store and buy whatever. You want what's generally referred to as greenhouse grade plastic that has some UV stabilization, because your goal, especially if you're doing multi 2 layers, you want that plastic to last 3-4 years. And so 6 mil is pretty standard. I know some people get by with thinner, but that would be my suggestion. It's a lot of work to put the plastic on. And so my personal preference is, if I'm going to do all that work, I'd rather have it be, better quality than having to do it more often. But I know some people take the other stance where let's just use it short term and replace it more often. But I would tend to lean towards the greenhouse grade 6 mil type thickness.
Thanks. Does anyone else have a question for Randall? Don't be shy. Oh, all right. I think the last thing to do is this is a seminar series. So we have other seminars upcoming webinars in this series. So in 2 weeks, we have choosing berry crops for a high tunnel, then day neutral strawberries, brambles, and controlling the environment in a high tunnel. And Maya posted the link in the chat if anyone wanted to sign up for these other ones if they haven't done so already. So. All right, I think that's it. Thank you, Randall. That was really awesome. It was really good information. Definitely have some questions about some of the ones that I've seen set up around and even at our Hort station. So definitely things to think about.
Thank you. Have a good one, everyone.